I want to welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm Katie Corcus. I'm the program specialist at the library. And I want to welcome you on behalf of the library and Los Alamos County. I want to thank them also for providing us the opportunity to have this talk in this building. I also want to thank Friends of Los Alamos County Libraries for supporting all of our programs. And I want to thank the Historical Society for all of their support. They are selling books and they have a wonderful museum shop, several items on display, and I want to thank Heather McClenahan for helping to arrange the talk and publicize the talk, and Todd Nichols and Michelle Stump for working as gift shop people to sell books and sell other products here tonight. It's such a pleasure, and I'm so excited to introduce Jenny and Sherry Thompson. Their story of how they created this book is a fascinating one, especially because they had to communicate across the ocean, with one living in Santa Fe and one in Estepona. So I'm sure they'll tell you more about that. And the book, the topic itself is fascinating. We will have a copy in the library. And thank you again. Hope you can patronize both the Historical Society, the History Museum gift shop, and the library. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie. Can you guys hear me too? Okay, great. So we are very appreciative that our friends, Linda and Red, who are residents of Los Alamos, Red and Linda McClellan, who introduced us to Katie Corcus, and also to Todd Nichols and Heather McClenahan, and thank them very much for the opportunity to be here tonight, and of course all of you for being willing to listen to us talk about our book, our long project. We want to thank you and for the Fuller Lodge for letting us be here. We're very honored to be here, and we're happy to have this opportunity to talk about our father and about our work in telling his story.
Okay, so what we want to do tonight is, first of all, to tell you about the adventures of writing the book, what we had to do to write it and why it took 15 years to do so. And then we'll tell you something about what's in the book. And finally, we'd like to share with you some of the things that we learned while we were researching and writing the book.
But before we do that, we're going to start with a Russian fable. And the reason we're doing that is because our father used to begin his speeches with this Russian fable. And it goes like this. There was a Russian peasant who was walking his livestock to market early one winter cold morning. And he came upon a little bird in the middle of the path, and the bird was frozen. He picked up the bird and realized that there was a faint, tiny heartbeat, and he wasn't sure quite what to do with it, and he was walking along, and he noticed that one of his cows had made a big pile of steaming dung on the side of the path. And he had an idea, so he took the bird and he put it gently into the hot dung, and he went along his way. Pretty soon the sun started to rise, and it was warming the air, and the bird was warming up in the cow dung, and he woke up and the little bird realized that he was still alive, and he was so happy and thankful that he was still alive. He started to sing his little bird song, and he was chirping and singing and so happy to be alive. And a little fox in the woods nearby heard all this commotion, and he came running out of the woods, saw the bird in the cow dung, plucked the bird out, and gobbled him up. And the moral of this story is that the one who gets you in it is not necessarily your enemy, and the one who gets you out of it is not necessarily your friend. And when you find yourself neck deep in it, don't sing.
All right, so now we're going to start singing, and we hope that there are no foxes out there. All right, when we started this project, we really had no idea what we were doing. We wanted to get to know more about our father. He died when he was rather young, and we were young when he died, so we didn't know a lot of the things that he did during his career, and we wanted to discover those. We also wanted to discover this for our children and for our grandchildren because they never had the opportunity to get to know him. We meant this just as a project, a family project, and we weren't sure at the beginning that we were going to be able to gather enough material even to write a book. And there were moments when we weren't sure we were going to finish it, when our spirits flopped and we didn't know we were going to get to the end.
As Jenny said, we thought this was just a project, a family project. It wasn't a book as we started. But we began by talking to our father's former colleagues and people who knew him and began researching it that way. And we were encouraged by virtually all of them that this should be an actual book, a book to be published. And so we took their advice to heart and we began to think of it that way. They said that there was no biography of him. Because our father died young, he never published his own memoirs or wrote memoirs. And they said this was an important thing that we should, in fact, do. So now we want to introduce him not only to ourselves and our children, but to you as well, and we'll begin to do that a little bit tonight. Once we decided that it should be an actual book, a real serious book, we tried to get grants to help us in our research. But because we're not affiliated with any institution, we're not affiliated with the university or anything like that, we weren't eligible for anything. It was just about at this time that our older sister, she was the one with the chef making the meatballs. She died, sadly, and she left us a small inheritance. And Jenny and I talked about it, and we decided that we would use that money to fund this project, which is what we did. So over the 15-year course of researching and writing the book, we held full-time jobs, we raised families, we stole away time and used our vacation time to do this work, which is one reason why it took us so long to do it.
That's right. The other reason was that we really had to teach ourselves how to do this work. We'd never done archival research before. Maybe some of you have done that, but we just thought it was like going to a library and say, give us everything you have on Thompson, and it doesn't work that way. And more importantly, we realized that to understand what our father did, the events that he was involved in, we had to understand the history. We had a sort of reasonable education, but obviously we were missing a lot of things, so we had to teach ourselves all of these things. So it was really a self-teaching experience, and one that we thoroughly enjoyed. We never realized how interesting it could be to actually research history and how exciting it could be. We couldn't have done it any sooner because, as Katie mentioned, I live in Spain and my sister lives in Santa Fe, so we needed Skype, we needed emails, and we needed the internet to do some of our research.
And not only that, but many of the documents that we used for our research were not available, or at least not declassified any earlier than that. So it takes about 50 years before documents are generally declassified. And even then, when we started, a lot of them still were. We had to file many Freedom of Information Act requests, some of which were granted, some of which were not. And each year we would meet, Jenny would fly over from Spain and I would go to the East Coast, and we'd meet at the National Archives and start and work on our book there. Luckily for us, we were guided through the Byzantine mazes of the archives by really wonderful archivists, and we are forever grateful to those people who were fantastic. They were marvelous. The only archive that was completely unhelpful to us was the CIA archive. We did file Freedom of Information Act request when we very first started this, and they said, we can neither confirm nor deny that we have any documents at all pertaining to Llewellyn Thompson. Well, we knew that that wasn't true because they had his name on their own website. So we said, well, we're going to file an appeal, and we did. And we filed an appeal, and that was about 10 years ago. And about every 3 years, we write them a letter and we say, how's that appeal going? And they say, you know, these things take time, and you just have to be patient, and we never have gotten a response.
Right, so that's really the adventure of writing the book. Now we want to tell you something about what's in the book. It's a biography, so obviously it covers his life, and since he was involved in most of the important events of the Cold War, it's also an overview of the Cold War. Thompson's story begins in Colorado and New Mexico, where his father had a hard-scrabble sheep ranch. Our father formed his personality and his character in this place, and it was the old-time sort of American ethic, forthrightness, honest approach that made his later diplomatic career successful. This was really a very important thing to take into consideration.
As Jenny said, the book does cover many of the events of the Cold War, everything from the writing of the Truman Doctrine to the Six-Day War. And we do write about those events in some detail in the book, but don't worry, we're not going to cover all of them here tonight, I promise. But we will highlight a few.
One of them, I think one of his first exciting posts was to the Soviet Union during the Second World War when he was staying in Moscow. When the Germans besieged the city, the Soviet government was evacuated, as was all the diplomatic corps, to Kuibyshев, a city about 800 kilometers away from Moscow. So Thompson found himself as a junior officer in a very sort of unique position of having to deal with Stalin and Molotov, who also stayed in Moscow. And he called it his sort of post office job because he was taking communications between Roosevelt and to Stalin, and Stalin back to the States. But this experience of having sort of participated in the war, the terrible moments of that Moscow siege, would help him later on when he went back as ambassador, because the Russians would realize that he had shared those terrible moments with him.
Yeah, I mean, to share a danger and fear of death and hiding in the subway together, that was a really visceral and emotional time for all of them. But his first post as chief of mission, you know, as the boss, if you will, was when he was assigned to Austria shortly after the war, when that city or that country was still under Allied occupation. There he negotiated the Austrian state treaty that gave Austria back its sovereignty. So up until that time, 10 years after the war, Austria was still under occupation and a divided country. And after that treaty, that removed Soviet troops from Austria's territory, which, by the way, was the first and only time that Soviets relinquished their hold on a territory that they had occupied. He also, during the time that he spent in Austria, he successfully negotiated the Trieste settlement between, Trieste was a city that was claimed by both the Yugoslavs and the Italians. And at that time, it was a dispute that nobody thought was able to be settled. They didn't think it was possible to settle. It had been under dispute for a very, very long time. And he was able to settle that.
Right, and really because of these successes, Thompson was appointed then as ambassador to the Soviet Union. He arrived in Moscow in 1957, and this was just about the time that Khrushchev was consolidating his power and his leadership. And there he developed a very sort of unusual understanding of Khrushchev and a special relationship with him. This would help him when he returned from Moscow. It would be 1962. He returned in September. And obviously in October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis broke. And so it was his special understanding of Khrushchev that helped him be a good advisor to President Kennedy. When the crisis was over, Robert Kennedy said he had been the most valuable advisor to his brother. And McNamara called him the unsung hero of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Dean Rusk sort of called him the Russian in the room. It was his understanding of Khrushchev that helped predict what would happen with any of the moves that Kennedy decided to do.
And a year later, or in 1963, after Kennedy was assassinated, Lyndon Johnson became the president. And he kept Thompson on as his special advisor on Soviet affairs. But he also made him Deputy Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, and that was, I believe, the highest career position in the State Department at the time. This brought our father into other global issues at the time, so he wasn't dealing just with Soviet affairs, but many other global issues. And our father didn't really want that position. He called it his second job. But it also brought him into the Vietnam issue, which was also difficult for him. Johnson then in 1967 asked him to go back to Moscow as ambassador. He didn't really want to go, but he was a public servant and that was his ethos, and he said, of course I'll serve my president and I will go back. Johnson had hoped that Thompson could persuade the Soviets to intercede and between the United States and North Vietnam. He thought that the Soviets could be an intermediary and help solve the Vietnam crisis, the Vietnam quagmire, if you will. It didn't work out that way, but instead what our father did do was he used that time to lay the groundwork for disarmament, and that led to the strategic arms limitation talks, or the SALT process. And, excuse me. So that's basically what's in the book. Those are some of the highlights, and that runs the breadth of his career. But like most kids, we were told by our father many lessons that he wanted to impart, and we completely ignored them. But as we began writing and researching the book, we absorbed those lessons again. We understood, we started to understand what he was really trying to tell us. And so we wanted to share with you through our understanding of what his lessons were through his career. And when he was in dealing with the Soviets, Thompson thought that there were two ways to go about this. Two ways to go about dealing with the threat of spreading communism. One he called the negative approach, and the other the positive. The negative approach was to answer Soviet bloc threats with our own intimidation. The positive approach was to concentrate on strengthening our own democratic institutions, to make the United States a beacon, if you will, to make it a more desired goal over communism for other countries, because at that time we were really afraid that communism would spread around the world. There was no need for our aggression, because he believed that communism would ultimately fail. It would either have to adapt to a changing environment and become a system that we could deal with, that we could do business with, sort of like China has, or perhaps Vietnam, or it would implode upon itself eventually. It was just a matter of time. He also believed that in foreign policy, one should not strive to be a hawk nor a dove, but rather to be an owl, and to find areas of mutual benefit rather than going for a short-lived win or one-upmanship.
Yeah, and he always counseled to look further down the road. He said it was very important to consider always the consequences of any given decision or policy. It was a bad idea to go for a short-term gain at the expense of what could be really negative long-term effects. One example of this was sending the Gary Powers U-2 flight over the Soviet Union. The purpose of this flight was to prove or to disprove the existence of the missile gap in the favor of the Soviets. The first big summit between the Western Allies and the Soviets since the war was only 2 weeks away. It was scheduled for the 16th of May, I believe. And they were going to discuss disarmament and also access to Berlin. The choice of May 1st, which was kind of like choosing July 4th for Americans, so close to the summit, was really unnecessarily provocative. It seemed that a short-term intelligence gathering was more important than the possibility of starting détente. The excuse given for the choice of May 1st was that the weather was too bad any earlier date. But we were able to find archived weather information that clearly shows this was not the reason. Because of this choice, we lost an opportunity. We sort of think it was a turning point in the Cold War that didn't happen. And in our opinion, it's an event that was not given enough attention in the Cold War narrative.
But if you're going to look further down the road, you have to be to anticipate the long-term consequences. And to do that, you have to understand the other. You have to be able to put yourself in the other person's shoes and develop some kind of cognitive empathy. You have to be able to judge what their reactions are going to be to your own actions and your own decisions.
And one example of this was, well, if the Cuban Missile Crisis was sort of an acute illness, the Berlin crisis was a chronic disease. One kept us on the brink of war for a week, 13 days, and the other for decades. For Khrushchev, what was important was to secure East Germany in the Soviet bloc. It was kind of like his super domino. If East Germany went to the west, then the rest of the bloc could fall, and this would sort of end his little buffer that was protecting the Soviet Union. And we kept putting Khrushchev off and talking about East Germany. We only wanted to talk about Berlin. So Khrushchev started taking more and more risks. He created multiple crises. He started giving ultimatums right and left. And ultimately, we think it played a role in his decision to put missiles in Cuba. Because Khrushchev once said, if I go into a cathedral and pray for peace, nobody listens. But if I go in with a bomb under each arm, they do.
So Thompson thought it was also important to keep talking because he wanted above all to prevent miscalculation and misunderstanding. Even to keep talking when there was no evident solution at hand, like in Berlin. We talked and talked and talked and talked, and there wasn't any solution, but eventually it worked its way out, and we never did come to blows during that long, long crisis. And in order to keep talking and develop important understanding, you can't be isolated. You can't isolate yourself, you can't isolate the other. And for that, you need Foreign Service officers. You need them on the ground with experience, career Foreign Service officers. You need them there with networks of people that they know and have developed relationships with so that they can send meaningful and useful reports back to the decision makers. For example, for us, we're saddened that there are many places where we don't have ambassadors in vital missions like South Korea and right now even Mexico. And we don't have missions in strategically important countries like Iran. So we don't really know what's going on in those places.
Yeah, we feel that the State Department is very underutilized, and it should become once again an important professional organization of career Foreign Service officers. Diplomacy has a very crucial role to play in this very complicated and dangerous time. And before we open up to questions, Sherry is going to read a short passage from the book that is actually Thompson's voice, so you will hear his own opinion in his own words.
And we hope that all of you will read the book, and that when you do, you will learn those lessons as well, and you'll agree with us and find some of your own. So, he said, "The most striking thing when one looks at all the wonderful things that have been accomplished in the material field is the little progress we have made in changing the nature of man. I should like to hope that we are entering the era of the rule of law, of disarmament, and of recognition of the brotherhood of man. As one looks around today, at today's disputes, virtually all of which are unnecessary and are capable of solution to the benefit of all parties concerned, I must confess I see little reason to be optimistic. Nevertheless, we must keep on trying and hope that we can bring up future generations sufficiently free from our vices and weaknesses that they can deal with the world's problems in a more rational way than we have been able to do." Thank you.
So we're going to open it up for questions, and I will bring the mic to you so that everybody can hear your question.
I really enjoyed the photos that you had on the screen. Could you run through them and talk about it?
Sure. Sound off. So it begins in Corona, which is the site of our grandfather's ranch. And Corona is a small town in sort of halfway between Klein's Corners and Roswell. It's where the UF. Oh. Okay.
No, it's fine.
It's where the UFO landed. And this was our pilgrimage to our grandfather's ranch. And I've lived in New Mexico for over 20 years, so I know this landscape, but it was quite an experience for Jenny to see it. And that house is the ranch house. And our father spent a lot of time in the bunkhouse, which was made out of rocks that they picked up out of the fields for the sheep, and you can see that they made do with whatever they found to make the barns. Then this is our trip to the various presidential libraries. We went to the Kennedy Library, that's the Johnson Library. So we stood in front of his Cadillac. We were invited to go to Vienna to a conference on the Vienna summit between Kennedy and Khrushchev. So we were there, and that was our old house. No, that was the Russian embassy.
Yeah, that was the Russian embassy. That man there in the middle between us is Sergei Khrushchev. Khrushchev's son. That's the ambassador's residence in Vienna. That's Thompson, obviously, when he was young. And that's our mother. When they first met, that's what she looked like. That's his aunt, his sister, his parents, and him in front of the car.
That's the bunkhouse.
That's the bunkhouse.
Where he spent time as a boy and learned how to play poker.
That's his brother. He loved to do fishing, fly fishing. That's him with his brother and his sister raising rabbits. This one, which one? That one is him, and that's him on a horse. Can we stop for a minute? I just wanted to say something. When my sister went to my father one day and said, I want to take up horseback riding, he was shocked. He said, I can't understand why anybody wouldn't want to ride a horse for fun.
And this was when he was posted to Ceylon. That was his first posting. He thought he was a dandy. This was his first posting in Moscow, where he was Stalin. And this was during the siege of Moscow, where all the women went out and dug trenches to stop the tanks.
That's him in
There he was in the front of the Kremlin as a young officer. That was duded up in his new Russian attire when he first got there. That's him with Bulganin. This is him with Adlai Stevenson and Chip Bolin,
That was his best friend.
his best friend throughout his life. That the one with the dog is our sister, the one who died, and the little one is Jenny. That's our sister Andy, with the crazy Italian chef. That's our mother and our father at Wolfgangsee in Austria. There they are dancing. Our mother looking quite bored, but she loved it. Our father skiing in Austria. He was quite the skier. And again, and there they are.
You realize I was so fat.
He liked to play the violin. There's a nice story in the book about how he saved the day playing the violin. There he is coming out of the Austrian state treaty negotiations, and there he is at the end where they signed the Austrian state treaty.
Dulles is giving a speech that he had to.
There's our father smiling, grinning ear to ear, which is an unusual pose for him. There he is with Dulles and Eisenhower after the treaty was signed.
Wow.
And we're not sure exactly where he was coming from on that plane, but we like that picture. That's our mother in Austria. She helped the Hungarian refugees set up workshops so that they could make some money, and after they fled Hungary during that terrible time.
That picture was when we first got a glimpse of the United States. We came over on the ship, right?
That was our first trip to the United States.
Our father with the Kremlin in the background. That's him in front of the Foreign Office, the Soviet Foreign Office. And that's the Kremlin, obviously. And that's our house. That was Fossil House. That was the ambassador's residence with the guard outside. They were looking at a tank, weren't they, at that time? That's the dacha. We had the American Embassy had a country house that we could use. That's our father changing a tire, or watching a tire being changed. That's our dacha. That's where our father
place.
Yeah, our father with reporters,
That's him playing poker.
which he also learned in New Mexico.
That was our playground. The
Yeah.
American kids, that was where we. And that was the
Demonstration
against the Lebanon and the detritus from it. That was-
Our mother dancing.
She arranged ballet classes for the ladies with a former instructor for the Bolshoi Ballet, which was a really wonderful thing because she thought the women needed to exercise. The entire diplomatic corps got to do that, and she had us do that. Jenny hated it, I liked it. And later on, they canceled those classes, which was a terrible shame because they thought it somehow was going to be subversive and we were all going to become communist if we took ballet classes.
Yeah. It was really great because it's also a chance for the children of the different embassy missions to get to know each other. Otherwise, we wouldn't be together. I always used to hide in those lessons. That's our mother with, he was the chief of mission there, what do you call it?
The DCM.
Yeah. Our mother couldn't live without flowers, so she created a greenhouse and imported bulbs, and so at the American Embassy receptions, there are always lots of flowers.
One thing that's kind of interesting is that the ambassadors, I don't know how it works today, but you had a small stipend for entertainment. And if you weren't personally wealthy, which our parents were not, you had to kind of make do. So our mother had a greenhouse and she would grow flowers in order to be able to make the receptions look nice because we couldn't afford to go buy the flowers. And
Bring them from Helsinki.
And bring them from Helsinki. And she would grow also vegetables so that we could eat proper meals.
That's them in the main hall of the ambassador's residence.
That's
Salinger.
That's Pierre Salinger, and that's also at the dacha.
That's them in front of the dacha. That's our father during staff meetings at the embassy. That's us in the Troika. That's him and Charles Bolin. Charles Bolin played the piano and he played the violin. Bob Hope came into Moscow and gave some performances.
That's
This
I'm
is
in
my
the sunglasses.
favorite picture of Sherry, the one with the sunglasses. I have to show you again because it's such a fun.
Oops,
we're going backwards.
How did we do that?
Sure, when you get to the Nixon picture, tell them the story of Nixon. Right, at Sponsor House.
Is it going forward now?
Yeah. There you are again. See?
Okay.
Don't touch it. That's Khrushchev's visit to America. That's why is it going so fast?
I don't know, but that's okay.
That's the Benny Goodman concert. That's our father with the
Prince
Prince Conference, Kosygin, Gromyko. That's our father at Khrushchev's private dacha. That's kind of interesting because no one had ever been invited to go to his private home.
Even from Eastern Bloc countries.
That's us in Colorado. That's him with Kennedy. That's at the Vienna summit when Khrushchev and Kennedy met. That's during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is the limited test ban with Dean Rusk flying to the Black Sea with Johnson and Rostow, was that?
Yeah.
This is during the Six-Day War and the
That's at the dacha.
in
That's
the,
in
what do you
the,
call it, the special room where they,
oh, in the Situation Room.
yeah.
And that was
It's
Salt
Salt
Talks.
Talks.
That's at Salt Talks.
That's
That's
when
his
he,
retirement?
yeah, retirement speech.
And that's it. Sorry, that was a long answer.
So the excerpt we read from the book, about what year would that have been?
That would have been in the late 60s.
Did you ever attempt to get access to any Russian archives?
Yes, and we were very successful there. They were very forthcoming. The Russian Federation, we didn't even have to travel there. We asked them for documents and they Xeroxed them and sent them to us. And we were also, when we went to that Vienna conference, we met the gentleman who is the chief archivist for the former KGB archives. And he didn't send us actual documents, but he was helpful with us with information.
Any real surprises come out of those archives?
No, actually, what was nice about those documents was that we could compare them with the documents that came from the American archives, the memorandum of conversation, and they matched almost perfectly, which was really nice, so that each side said the same thing about the meeting.
Hi, Congello. Hi, Sherry.
Oh, hey!
So, did you guys have any idea, any appreciation for who all these famous people that were hanging around the house, hanging around the family at the time?
Oh, good question.
No, not really. I mean, we knew that Khrushchev was a big deal, but we quite liked him. He was very much, he liked children. He was very warm. It's kind of a funny story. When Bob Hope came, we were so far removed from who was famous in the United States that our mother went up to him and said, "Oh, Mr. Hope, did you bring your violin with you?" Because she thought he was Jack Benny. That did not go over well.
The other thing we had, obviously, we had, our father supported the cultural exchanges. He believed this was very, very important. So we had a lot of famous people coming through, like Elizabeth Taylor and Kim Novak and these kind of people. And so we sort of got used to having famous people around. And I think after that it was kind of healthy because we never really thought that famous people were really so important.
Anybody else? No? Oh, yes.
Wait, I'm sorry. Just what were some of your favorite memories from Moscow?
There's so many. My goodness. Okay, I'll start. Yeah.
A lot of the embassy children, as they got older, their parents would send them out to Switzerland to boarding school. And neither Sherry and I wanted to go to boarding school, so we just said, no, we're not going to boarding school. So our father put us in Russian school. And so one of my favorite memories was coming home one day, and because of the Russian children that were good at school, they all wore red kerchiefs around their necks. They were pioneers, sort of the lower rung of the communist echelon. And I came home and I told my father that I wanted a red, kerchief around my neck, because the ones that didn't get to wear it were usually bad students, and I didn't want to be counted as a bad student. And he had to sit me down and explain why I could not wear a red kerchief.
Tell the story about the party.
Which party? We had a lot of
Party
parties.
that you got the kids to come to.
Oh, well, that wasn't really a party. That was a good story. Because many of the kids with the American kids or the diplomatic corps kids would come and go. They weren't there for very long. We soon learned that you couldn't really count on making close friendships with them. So they didn't hang around very long. We did have Russian friends, but they couldn't come in to play. So Jenny and I would play out on the square, but the kids couldn't come home with us. They weren't allowed. So my sister figured it out. And we used to read about America, which was very exotic for us. Read about covered wagons and Boy Scouts and things like that. So one year we got a red flyer wagon for Christmas. And we rigged up, my mother brought home a dog that came in a crate. My sister rigged up a crate in the red flyer wagon, and we put a blanket over it, so we made like a makeshift covered wagon out of it. We took the covered wagon out in the Ploshchad in the square.
With bicycles.
With bicycles in the front instead of horses. And we put kids inside. And we took the wagon back into our yard, and we emptied the children, and we went back out and we got more kids, and we did this a couple of times until we had a whole yard full of kids. And the butler saw us out there, and he brought us out cookies and juice on a silver tray, and the Russian kids just thought this was the nuts. And we had a wonderful party, and our father came home, and mother came home, and they had to take the kids out, and they were all terrified of going past the guard, but
We took them out far away so they could get away.
And it was okay, and, but that was good fun.
How old were you when you left in Russia?
Well, we were there twice, so when we left the first time, I guess I was about 12 and you were
8, almost 9.
And then on the second tour, we were, I was 17, 18, and she
I
was
was about 13, 14. So Jenny should have been a senior in high school, but she did a year at Moscow University, and I attended the Bolshoi Ballet School.
She was good at dancing.
See, those ballet classes paid off.
I enjoyed the talk a lot. I haven't read the book yet, but I'd like to know exactly where your father was from. I'm Colorado?
He was from Los Alamos, not far from Bent's Fort.
I
Yeah.
love that. But his grandfather still had the sheep ranch.
Yeah, he started out in Los Alamos, and he had a sheep farm with a man named Gunter, who became governor of Colorado, actually. And then he met a French Basque man by the name of Nalda, and they formed a partnership, and they started buying up property around Corona. They're homesteaded near Corona, between Corona and Vaughn, and they built up a fairly sizable sheep ranch. And the reason that New Mexico, University of New Mexico research station sign is up there is because 1/4 of the ranch became that. And that's really his roots, and that's when we started the talk, we really meant it. That's where he developed his the basis of his character, and that's what made him a good diplomat.
Where did he wind up going to school?
University of Colorado.
Okay, and was that, because, you know, he learned to play the violin and all?
Well, he did that before, and his sister, unfortunately she died when she was 16 in consumption, but his sister played the piano, he played the violin, and they used to make up music for the silent movies in Los Angeles.
What happened to the U.S. Embassy during the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Well, we were in Washington during the Cuban Missile Crisis, so I'm not sure.
We did talk to, remember Davies, he was the
Oh, yeah,
ambassador
that's
there. And he talked about them it being a very difficult time, very scary time, because of course they knew that if there was an exchange that they were going to go. So it was, he described it as being very frightening.
What did your time in Moscow teach you about the Russian character?
That's a very interesting question, and you know, because we lived there as children, it wasn't different for us. But in traveling around Europe, we would summer, oftentimes we either couldn't afford or didn't have time to come all the way back to the United States. So I was 6 or 7 before I ever came here. And in seeing different countries, and then coming to the United States after having lived in Moscow, the Russian character and the American character are much more similar than the American character and pretty much anywhere else I had visited. At least that's my impression.
I would agree with that, yeah.
Well, I guess that's it. Oh, sorry.
If you had one takeaway of something important that your father taught you, what would that be?
Well, I think it's empathy. You know, everything hinges on empathy, on being able to understand what somebody else's perspective is. Because without that, you can't, without that understanding, you can't look further down the road. I mean, he used to tell that to us all the time. I'll tell you a really brief story. Our father used to play cards a lot, and he used to also play chess with us. And he would never let us win. In fact, what he would do, he would play chess with you until he was about to win, and you were ready to give up, and then he would turn the board around and beat you with your own hand. And he would tell you, you know, you can't just look a couple of moves ahead. And he meant that in life, too. He really did. And you can't know that until you can put yourself in that other person's, see the board from their side.
And that doesn't mean, that doesn't mean sympathy or emotional empathy. It means, cognitive empathy. And that, I think, is something that's missing these days.
Thank you for that question. And thank you all for being here. Truly, it's such a privilege for us to be able to share our father's story with you, because he was a great man.
And he was from here.
And he was from here.